How to protect the high seas, home to millions of species and crucial to the world we live in. But from overfishing to deep-sea mining, they're threatened by overexploitation. Can a global treaty preserve them? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. International waters, the planet's last lawless wilderness. But they're also a vast, thriving ecosystem critical to every living thing and providing half the oxygen we breathe. For the fifth time of trying in 15 years, delegates from 193 UN member states have met in New York. They're arguing over how to formalise a treaty of the high seas to protect the deep oceans. After 2 weeks of negotiations, the talks went way over their deadline. They're especially concerned about the impact of unregulated deep-sea mining and factory fishing and access to valuable genetic resources. Indeed, a big sticking point is how to secure fair access to marine resources for all. The United Nations chief, Antonio Guterres, urged them to seize the moment. He said this treaty could ensure the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity over 2/3 of our life-sustaining ocean space. It can help ensure resources are accessed and utilised for the benefit of all humanity. It can provide an adequate framework for the use of marine protected areas to conserve and sustainably manage vital habitats in species. It can make sure that environmental impacts of activities are assessed and fully considered in decision making. So why is this treaty just so important? Well, rules currently only apply to a distance of 200 nautical miles from coastlines. Beyond that lie these international waters where there's little or no governance. And the treaty would govern human activity on and under the high seas. It aims to end unregulated practices, as I say, like unsustainable fishing, and clarify what resources can be taken and from where. All right, let's take this on. We can join our guests now. In London is Will McCallum, a co-executive director at Greenpeace UK. In New York is Minna Epps, head of the ocean team at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And in Stockholm is Robert Blasiak, researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. A warm welcome to all of you. Will, could I start with you first of all? So let's explore why we need a treaty. We've touched on it a little bit, but the high seas are owned by no one and by everyone. So why do we need jurisdiction over these waters that are out of mind and out of sight?
Well, that's precisely the problem. Is we live on a blue planet, and yet half of this planet is in these international waters that, as you say, are out of sight and out of mind, and we just haven't been paying them the attention that they need. We know that the oceans are under the most incredible pressure, whether that be from climate change, from overfishing, from mining. And we know that it cannot continue to sustain these pressures. We're losing ocean species at twice the rate as we are species on land. So this treaty provides us with this amazing, hopeful moment where countries could come together and actually say enough is enough. We have to reverse this trend. We have to start putting in place the rules that will allow us to treat this global commons with respect, with the attention it deserves.
And Minna, the ocean's a crucial element in our whole planetary system. We all need them, every living thing.
Yes, that is absolutely true. I mean, we've seen a drastic decline in marine biodiversity, but also a lot of the human pressures really affecting our ocean, whether it's overfishing or plastic pollution, but also very much exacerbated by climate change. And the UN Secretary General last year declared an ocean emergency, and we need to take this emergency, tackle it with great urgency. And I think this treaty is really needed. It's been in discussion for about 20 years. And then 5 years and 5 rounds of negotiations. We're at the resume session with really to conclude. So we need this treaty urgently in order to, as we heard, to really create a framework for countries to work together to protect. We've come together already at the end of last year. The world came together with a very ambitious agenda of protecting 30% of our land, seas, coastal areas and seas. So if we are to achieve that objective, we can do it with the high seas. And we need this legally binding instrument to really create that legal, holistic, cover the gaps in the legal framework to actually establish marine protected areas and really to tackle marine biodiversity protection and climate change action.
And Will, this success that was seen in Montreal, the 30 by 30, how does that tie into this treaty?
Well, at the moment, like I said, half this planet is what this treaty is trying to set rules for. So you can't really achieve protecting at least 30% of it unless we have this treaty. It's an absolutely crucial milestone to reaching that goal. And 30 by 30, it sounds wildly ambitious, but this is exactly what scientists tell us is needed to help the ocean restore, to help it rebound, to help it be more resilient to climate change. So this treaty is an absolutely essential tool in helping deliver all of that.
And isn't, Will, one of the issues in this whole debate how to establish and maintain MPAs in areas that aren't governed by any individual country? You know, looking at it dispassionately, you'd say, yeah, that's going to be a challenge.
Exactly. In 2019, we sailed from pole to pole, from the Arctic to the Antarctic, visiting some of these areas on the high seas that we want to be protected. We saw some absolutely astonishing wildlife out there. We met coastal communities along the way who are so dependent on this wildlife, and it's heartbreaking to think that there is absolutely no way for us to protect all of this amazing biodiversity out there. So we need this treaty. We need it now. We're already at the start of 2023. That is just 7 years left to deliver on that really ambitious package that was agreed in Montreal last year by governments. So this treaty and agreeing it right now is so important.
Minna, so this is all about the sustainable management of ocean resources, and that's precisely what is under threat without some form of governance.
Well, it's basically the holistic and equitable management of the ocean and its resources. So this treaty is an internationally legally binding treaty for conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity. So it's actually a package deal. So it really looks at several different elements. So, for example, creating marine protected areas in the high seas, and not just marine protected areas, but also network of marine protected areas, as well as how are you going to look at capacity development, capacity building, and the transfer of marine technology, and also how would you actually go about conducting environmental impact assessment, and finally also looking at marine genetic resources and how the access to and equitable benefit sharing of marine genetic resources. That is kind of the package deal that's being discussed here. And of course, there are several cross-cutting issues as well.
And Robert Blasiak in Stockholm, the bioprospecting for marine genetic resources is a big issue, as Minna was talking about there. And Big Pharma, basically tell us more about it. Big Pharma wants a piece of this action. Why do they want it and what's it used for?
Yeah, well, really kind of the thing that everyone is hoping for is to discover another aspirin in the ocean, some really important drug that's going to benefit humanity. This is what the big pharma companies are dreaming of. And once in a blue moon, they find it. So in the case of marine drugs, there are about a dozen that have gotten FDA approval and are now on the market. And if you want to think about how much they're worth, if you look at just 5 of those drugs, then over the past 10 years, they've gotten sales and licensing revenues of $12.1 billion US. So this is the sort of dollar sign that's on people's minds when they think about marine genetic resources. I should emphasize, though, all of those drugs, they're from marine genetic resources from within national jurisdiction. They're not from areas beyond national jurisdiction. So there's a big question mark for everyone. What's out there? What's it worth? Nobody knows. It's exactly what's tricky to negotiate about.
Right, and Will, that's the thing, isn't it? We could find many, many great things of incredible value to science, but also of incredible value to big corporations.
Absolutely. It would be incredible value to science, potentially incredible value to corporations. I think from a Greenpeace perspective, and certainly a civil society perspective, we'd like to make sure that whatever is found, the benefits are shared equally amongst communities all over the globe. More than half of this planet depend on the ocean for their primary source of food. Coastal communities everywhere are struggling with the pressures of the ocean. We think that they deserve some of the benefit of anything that's found out of there.
And Minna, explore that a little bit further for us, if you would. How do you make this equitable? I mean, it's an enormous challenge, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think multilateralism in itself, and we do have that global north, global south divide. And I think that often comes down to perhaps a lack of trust, which is, not a favorable conditions when you are going to do carry out negotiations. And I think also what you said, what Robert was saying in terms of this is kind of in the future. So we don't really know. We might hit a lot of threats or not. So it's that. But, they want to make sure that you can have, not only access, but also there is a kind of a legal certainty that they can actually share those benefits in an equitable way. So I think that also really comes down to, is also a lot of this treaty throughout. I mean, marine genetic resources is not the only part that will deal with finances, but it really comes down to, I think, more, principles of equity and solidarity. And I think we've heard that throughout. So of course, there has been a lot of concessions made, I would say, from all sides in order to get a landing zone for these different areas that have been negotiated for such a long time.
And it's not just about equity, Will. It's also about, potential environmental damage. And, the deep ocean, we know more about Mars, as they say, than we do about the deep ocean, and the potential damage that can be done by extraction.
Absolutely, and one of the things that this treaty could offer is a much more holistic approach to industries that are operating out there in the ocean, an approach that would require them to actually do proper environmental impact assessments, so that we can really assess what risks we're placing this largely unknown ecosystem under. The deep ocean is also the world's largest carbon store. It's got so many new species. Almost every time you dive down there, you're going to be discovering something new. And yet we still seem to be in a position where we're about to let mining happen in it. Just in the coming months, decisions could happen that would allow companies to go out there and start exploiting the deep sea.
Yeah, and Robert, let's explore that a little bit further, this issue of deep sea mining, every possibility of a deep sea gold rush to mine metals. Tell us what's down there and why mining companies are so interested in getting their hands on it.
Well, let me start by something my good friend and colleague Diva Amon always says. She says, when you think about the deep sea, think about a giant flat screen TV, and only 3 or 4 pixels on that flat screen are working. That's our knowledge of the deep ocean. It's really limited. Every time we go down there, as Will says, we learn new things. But I would revert back also to something Minna was just saying. I mean, we've been talking about BBNJ for 20 years now. What has happened in 20 years?
BBNJ, I should just say that is this High Seas Treaty.
Exactly right, yes. And in those 20 years, what's happened with biotechnology? Well, it's been moving at light speed. It's exactly what the United Nations does not do. So what has happened? Well, the cost of sequencing a raw megabase of DNA, it's fallen by 7 orders of magnitude in that time, from over $6,000 for one base pair to less than 1 cent today. That's monumental. And what's been happening in parallel is that you have these massive exponentially growing databases of genetic sequence information, the language of life. And this is growing exponentially, doubling in size every 18 months for the last 30 years. This is the sort of stuff the UN really needs to be moving quickly. It needs to wrap up treaties. It needs to really be on top of these things. And it just isn't. I mean, this is one of the hardest things to negotiate, with unclear values, fast-moving science, and no one really knowing how to navigate the equitable sharing of benefits of something we don't really know exactly what the value of will be.
Minna, would you like to react to that? The moving fast is not something that the UN does easily.
No. For sure. I mean, that's not what the United Nations is known for. And I think that really this treaty needs to be strong, future-proof, which is then also means climate-proof. But I think what it has to do, it has to have enough mechanism and modalities for doing that. So when it's the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from marine genetic resources and the digital sequencing information, it needs to have these kind of provisions that are, workable and the fair modalities for sharing of both monetary and non-monetary benefits. So we can still kind of stipulate the mechanism, but we don't know. So I think a lot of this has been a challenge, and it's quite interesting to see that it was not really anticipated before that that was going to be the main issue what we're talking about. It was always talking about fisheries and making sure that, fisheries was not excluded from this, to make sure, because that was seen as a major threat. And here we are so quite far into the negotiation round. It actually became really, really obvious that marine genetic resources and the access and benefit sharing was a major sticking point.
Sure. Will, can we just return to this issue of mining and how you mentioned how exploration has already begun, that licenses may be granted later this year. It's really going to come to the fore as this year goes on. There's a deep irony here, isn't there? That the reason why they want to go down there is to, create more EVs, more batteries and so forth, which is for the environmental good, but getting at them is not.
Well, so they say. I mean, actually, if you speak to some of the car companies and the tech companies, which I have, and Greenpeace is in close communication with them, the companies who are making these products aren't asking deep sea mining companies to go down there and exploit. In fact, some of them, like BMW, have actually committed to not source from deep sea mining. Most car companies and tech companies we speak to are actually looking to move away from these materials altogether towards a much more closed circle where they are reusing old materials, because ultimately anything where you're mining, anything where you're extracting new, opens a new frontier, opens a whole new set of ethical considerations that they just don't want to get involved with.
Minna, you mentioned fisheries. We've heard much about and seen much about overfishing in inshore waters. Tell us more about what goes on out of sight and out of mind out in the high seas.
Yes, I think there is a misconception in terms of, there is that kind of gap in terms of the whole management of fisheries and the ocean governance as a whole. And I think for fisheries at the moment, there are another agreement called the United Nations Fish Stocks Agreement, and has a structure of regional fisheries management organization that are also kind of responsible for managing the activities of fisheries. But we know that our oceans are still very much overfished today. And there needs to be a very strong improvement. So I think there has been an ongoing affair from the fishing industry that this treaty would then actually control or override those regional fisheries body, and which is not what it's trying to do. Instead, it's trying to strengthen what's already there, but bringing in what was said earlier, a more holistic view to make sure that fisheries are managed sustainably. So again, it comes back to perhaps again a lack of trust, and I think the big fear is that if we're going to reach this 30 by 30 target of protecting at least 30% of our ocean by 2030, we're going to be closing a large part of the ocean in the high seas for marine protection. So I think there is that kind of misconception, which was really in the beginning of these negotiations, really taking up a lot of space. But we have to manage our fisheries sustainably. We have to protect biodiversity. Of course, we have to talk about sustainable use, but conservation comes first.
And Will, just coming back to the MPAs, these marine protected areas, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's been shown that once you have an MPA, then fish stocks around them and outside them actually increase.
Absolutely. The main reason to create marine protected areas is because there's an overwhelming burden of evidence that these are perhaps not a silver bullet, but as close as you can get to one in the ocean. They really help increase the number of fish, increase the range of different kinds of species in an area, and then those fish get bigger, they get older, they get fatter, they have more babies, and those babies swim out beyond the boundaries of that marine protected area. So if we're worried about food security, if we're worried about communities living on the coast who might do subsistence fishing, if we're worried about the future of the ocean and the need for having as many different creatures in there as possible to sink as much carbon down to the bottom as we can, then marine protected areas really are one of those crucial tools. And without this treaty, we just can't create them in international waters.
Minna, as I said, this is the fifth attempt. This is a renewed fifth attempt at getting this done. Why is it so hard? And just who's getting in the way of progress here?
Well, for first of all, there were 4 rounds of negotiation, but then there was due to the global pandemic, and I think the pandemic really kind of slowed down it because it's absolutely impossible to do diplomatic relations over Zoom. So this in-person meetings really happened. So there was a long break, and the world looked very, very different when we come out. It's also a very different climate, both geopolitically than it was a couple of years ago. So I think that this kind of the long break that happened due to the pandemic made it like you can't just go back and pick up. Probably there could have been even more intersessional work done. So they had to pick up when they started, and some have changed both government, political positions. It might not be the same negotiators, etc. So I think that kind of played a role. So it was assumed that yes, they needed another round, and the last time it got so close, and basically saying, well, all we would need is a couple more days to kind of get it done. So, and then again, there was a resumed session with an additional 2 weeks of negotiation that was taking place in New York. And the political, there's been 51 countries that have signed up to a high ambition coalition to really behind BBNJ, the High Seas Treaty, also known as the BBNJ, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. So yes, the climate has slightly changed. So I think those are some of the key factors: the pandemic, the situation between Russia and Ukraine, the invasion, which had its 1-year anniversary taking place at the same time, was also concurrently here in the building, important meetings taking place. So I think those are some of the key factors that really made it even more difficult.
Sure. And are there the usual suspects who get in the way of getting things done?
I think that what they're doing here is actually creating an internationally legally binding instrument. And thereafter, there will be conference of party like we have now after the Paris Agreement. There's annual climate change meeting where it comes together. We want to make sure that those meetings have really empowered conference of parties. And I think what we are conscious of is that not having 1 or 2 countries blocking. So that's why it's very important that voting does not require consensus. There are, for example, 3 marine protected areas that have been pending in the Southern Ocean, and it's blocked year after year by 1 or 2 states. And this means that it cannot move forward. So that's why it's so important to have the right modality so that we can make progress, because if everything needs to be by consensus, we will never have that progress and advance as much as we want.
And Will, once a treaty is put into place and is formally adopted and formalised, and then this governance applies across the high seas in whatever shape or form it comes to be, who will then police it? How do we know that nations are adhering to this new high seas treaty?
Well, much in the same way that lots of international agreements covering the high seas police themselves. So we already have shipping, for example, the International Maritime Organization. Every industry has got its own bespoke way of policing and monitoring, and ultimately flag states, so those are the countries responsible for the industry or the boat or whatever it is going on out there, are the ones who are responsible for holding those boats or those industries accountable. Now, I think it is worth saying it is a vast area, and it is going to take international collaboration. And that's been one of the really key focuses for the treaty, is how to increase that collaboration, that internationalism, to make sure that it is possible to police these areas. And of course, every marine protected area proposal, if it comes in, will have its own monitoring and enforcement plan attached to it.
And Robert, you focus on the sustainable management of ocean resources. Are you confident that once a high seas treaty is formalised, that will be the instrument by which this sustainability can be managed?
Yeah, well, this is the big hope, that this treaty is going to provide that framework that requires transparency and traceability and full knowledge for everyone involved with bioprospecting, with marine biotechnology, that they will have full knowledge of what's happening in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Monitoring this is going to be very, very tricky. As I was saying earlier, this space is moving very quickly in terms of the science that's being developed today. So it's not something that the ink will dry on the paper and it will be quickly dated, probably. So there will need to be continuous focus on monitoring and enforcement, also with marine biotechnology based on genetic resources from areas beyond national jurisdiction.
And so, Minna, do you think we're at this kind of inflection point now, whereby that, with progress here and, progress that we saw in Montreal just before the end of last year in December, that we could be on the right track, on a better track to sustainability and in managing our oceans?
Yeah, I think one thing that's quite obvious here is that one of the sticking points have been, having that upfront investment. And, if you look at national budgets, I mean, if there's a disaster or a major urgency, there's usually not a problem to or announce big packages, whether it's for education, etc. And I think we still need to do a little bit more to really still recognize, the general knowledge and the common understanding of the important role of ocean and how we are all dependent on it. And now we are starting to see, for example, in the climate change debate, they're not just talking about the climate and biodiversity nexus, but really recognizing the important role of the ocean, both in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation. So I think it is coming together, and I think that we will welcome different synergies between these multilateral environmental agreements so we can move forward. But policy, it is essential, it is important, and to have this legal framework, but it is slower movement. What I think we need to see is looking at the science and the scientific and the emerging science, whether it's more scientific information about marine heat waves or etc., is to make sure that there's not a long time lag before it gets into policy. We're talking about solutions to climate change. We're all looking to the ocean. And we are already now, the policy there is lagging behind because, the private sector move in and talking about CO2 removal, etc., from the ocean. So I think that we need to do everything we can. And IUCN is hoping to be a bit of that science and policy bridge as well to make sure that, both in the right indicators and getting, science to policy. So I think that's really key to accelerate that because there cannot be that long timeline between the science. Look at climate change. It doesn't have, we can't afford to wait decades before action is taken.
Well, humanity has not been a great steward of our planetary system, so anything that creates some sort of defence over exploitation has got to be good news. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today, to Will McCallum, Minna Epps and Robert Blasiak. Thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team, it's goodbye.